Healthcare Online Journal Club. Today, we're going to be having Dr. Kefas Wida. He's a senior resident in the Department of Surgery, Federal Teaching Hospital, Gombe. He'll be discussing his proposal towards the fulfillment of being a fellow of the West African College of Surgeons, Orthopedics. So without further ado, good afternoon, Doctor. I think we can start. Thank you.
Thank you, Ma. Good afternoon, all. As introduced earlier, I'll be taking my dissertation proposal using this outline. I'll be introducing the title. I will also be reviewing some literature. Under the literature review, I will have this outline, then the methodology. I will be following this outline for it. Then I will check out my references. Then the appendix 1 and 2 will have the informed consent and the pro forma, and then we'll conclude. I will be rushing through. I have limited number of minutes. I have 20 minutes to do that, which I will try to maximize. So the topic, again, is bacterial contaminants, wound infection, and antibiotic susceptibility pattern of isolates from open lung bone fractures in the Federal Teaching Hospital, Gombe. And this is the target of the proposal as a partial fulfillment for fellowship in National Postgraduate Medical College. So the background here is that open lung bone fracture is one which the fracture hematoma communicates with the external environment. Open lung bone fractures are orthopedic emergencies and associated with high risks of infection and subsequent long-term morbidity. So the guiding principle in the management of all open lung bone fracture generally is prevention of infection. And the presence of wound in itself implies contamination, but not primary infection. So the prevention of contamination from becoming established infection is key in the initial management of open lung bone fracture. So overall, this study seeks to understand the bacterial contaminants present in open lung bone fractures, the bacteria implicated in the eventual cause of infection, and the antibiotic susceptibility pattern in order to effectively treat wounds, infections from such wounds. The statement of the problem here is that post-open fracture wound infection poses a great challenge to the healthcare system. Gombe State and indeed Nigeria, as part of a resource-poor healthcare delivery environment, has significant challenges of theater space, human resource, equipment, and so on. And as such, this infection is there both to the surgeon and the patient. So early isolation of the most culpable organism and its sensitivity pattern and providing the most suitable empirical antibiotics is key in the management of such conditions, which this study seeks to address. The relevance of the study here is that the use of prophylactic antibiotics in my hospital is based on foreign literatures and not based on a documented local findings in the hospital, vis-a-vis the pattern of bacterial contamination and the eventual cause of infection in open lung bone fractures. So this study would add to the body of knowledge in terms of getting the pattern and the antibiotic susceptibility of the bacterial contaminants themselves and those that eventually cause infection within the hospital. And this would enhance appropriate use of prophylactic antibiotics, reduce morbidity and the cost of care for the patients. To justify the study, the rising incidence of antibiotics from inappropriate use of antibiotics made it necessary to conduct the study to find out the common organisms and that are implicated in infections and among patients with open lung bone fractures, then to recommend appropriate antibiotics for prophylaxis to reduce the rate of infection among patients with open lung bone fractures in my hospital. And this is so because there's no similar research that has been done within the hospital. The study also seeks to address the problem of increased hospital stay, economic burden among patients with open lung bone fracture, as early isolation of the bacterial contaminants with the antibiotic sensitivity have shown to prevent progression from a multi-center similar study done in Nigeria. So what then are the research questions? Number one, what is the pattern of bacterial contaminants and the antibiotic sensitivities of the open lung bone fractures presenting at the Federal Teaching Hospital Gombe? The second research question here is to what is the rate of wound infection, the pattern of bacteria, and the antibiotic sensitivity of the isolates from infected open lung bone fractures after the removal. So for those that will present to the emergency, identifying the contaminants present in them is one, and then looking out for those that, among them, those that will eventually come out with infection, and then try to isolate the culpable organism there. So the general objective is to determine the pattern of bacterial contaminants, the rate of wound infection, and the antibiotic susceptibility pattern from wounds of open lung bone fractures in the Federal Teaching Hospital Gombe. So this is further broken down into specific objectives. Contaminants with their antibiotic susceptibility from wounds of open lung bone fractures in the, oh, my internet is unstable. Is it stable now?
Well, we can hear you clearly. At least I can.
Okay, fine. All right, fine. So that's the first, within those presenting within the first 24 hours. Then the second is to determine the rate of wound infection, the pattern of bacterial culture from the isolates of infected open lung bone fractures after the removal with the antibiotic susceptibility patterns within the hospital. Then the third is to determine the association between bacterial contaminants and post-debris wound infection among patients with open lung bone fracture in the Federal Teaching Hospital. The research hypothesis, the non-hypothesis here is that there's no significant statistical relationship between bacterial contaminants and post-debris wound infection among patients with open lung bone fractures in the Federal Teaching Hospital Gombe. And the alternative hypothesis here is that there is a significant statistical association between the two. The literature review that I'll be reviewing will have the following outline. I'll be looking at the relevant anatomy, and here is that open fracture vary greatly in severity and location. So different lung bones present with different mechanism of injury and then different outcomes of the impact of the injury. Location and the impact vary from bone to bone, as well as most of them being high energy injuries, and there's obvious skin loss and bone can be seen protruding through the bone. Well, in other cases, it could just be not larger than just a puncture wound, but they are also classified as open lung bone fractures. So the severity of the open fracture depends on several factors, including the level of culmination, the extent of tissue damage, and so on. Economic burden of infected lung bone fractures. In a regional trauma center in Nigeria, in Port Harcourt, University of Port Harcourt Hospital specifically, 769 cases were studied prospectively, and they found out that 2.2% of all open fracture resulted in amputation, and then most of which, talking about 126 of that number, turned out to be infected, which accounts for the most frequent complication in all open lung bone fracture in that study. A study also looking at the healthcare costs associated with surgical site infection found in open lung bone fracture showed that 2 to 5% of infection was seen in closed fractures, and as high as 20-30% was also seen in the same study done in the trauma center of University of Port Harcourt Teaching Hospital. Classification of open long bone fracture. The Gosiro and Anderson classification system is the most commonly used classification system for open long bone fractures. Although other forms of classification like China and Austin classification systems use, so that put into cognizance soft tissue damage, swelling, and compartment syndrome. But as to the Gosiro and Anderson classification, the reference point here is in the level of contamination of the open long bone, which makes it useful in my research. So I'll try to run through the classification quickly. The fracture into 3, type 1, 2, and 3. The type 1 is classifies an open long bone fracture with a puncture wound of or wound of less than 1 centimeter in diameter. That of 2 considers 1 to 10 centimeter in diameter of the wound, while 1 considers is being considered as the least severest form of open long bone fracture. 2 is considered as more the severest form of open long bone fracture. So, but for 3, usually the wound is greater than 10 cm and is further classified into A, B, C. Achievement of cover of wound is done via combination, and there's usually A and B in addition, a major vascular damage requiring a repair. But for the purpose of my study, that class of injury is being is taken as an exclusion criteria. So it's important to note also that Gosiro-Anderson classification is done intraoperatively. That's after the development of fracture. Risk factor for infection in open long bone fracture depends on a number of factors. The severity of the injury, the size of wound, patient comorbidities, and local wound characteristics. All these form factors that determine risk for infection in open long bone fractures. And also that the higher the type of Gosiro-Anderson classification, the higher risks associated with infection. Other risk factors include the method of fixation, the limb involved, the presence of other injuries, and then comorbidities, as well as lifestyle of the patients involved. Early antibiotic administration and surgical debridement have been shown to decrease the risk of infection. So the greater the damage to bone and soft tissue, the greater the risk for infection. And the time from injury to the time of first development is also a factor that contributes to the manifestation of infection in open long bone fractures. Next is the microbiology of bacterial contaminants and the infection in such fractures. So the process of wound infection is intricate and it involves a lot of molecular interactions of the numerous biological processes involved. So progression of an open long bone wound from being contaminated to being infected, and to also it can go to as far as manifesting in systemic illness if left untreated. So bacterial contamination of long bone fracture is the first step in the development of infection, which may occur from either endogenous or exogenous sources. And then from there, bacteria adheres to tissue or implant, as the case may be, if it proliferates without host response term colonization. And then from there, producing proteins that kill these. So, critical colonization stage is also the tipping point of the wound infection. where treatment becomes necessary to stop the progression of infection. So a typical time frame for the appearance of infection in open long bone fracture is typically within 3 to 7 days post-injury, as per definition. And for the purpose of this study, the time limit for which that will be looked out for is within 30 days post-debridement. So next we'll be looking at the debridement and skeletal stabilization of the open long bone, which is key in treating open long bone fractures as it allows for adequate wound healing and wound care. I prospectively collected data of all cases of open fractures in 2 regional trauma centers, University of Port Harcourt, and the State House Medical Center, Abuja, from 1st January 2007 to 31st December 2012, was evaluated to determine the pattern of presentation, treatment given, and the outcome. So from there, the total number of cases that had open fractures, 1,758, which constitute about 39% of all fractures seen in this center during the period. Persons between the age of 21 to 30 years were the highest affected group, with open fractures in the center accounting for 40%, while children and older persons 3.8 and 2.6% respectively. Male to female ratio 4.3 to 1. A significant proportion of the cases resulted from road traffic accidents of about 71.8%, while gunshots accounted for 313 cases and of all the cases. So type 1 and 2 open fracture constituted about 3% and 28% respectively, while type 3 accounted for 38.2%, involving mostly tibia. So most of the fractures were treated by external fixation. So 2.2% of them had amputation, and the most frequent complication as seen is worse infection, and it took about 7.2%. The length of hospitalization, duration, fracture union, and occurrence of infection were all significantly related to the severity of the open fractures. How then can we prevent infection in open long bone fracture? Open long bone fracture pose an immediate risk of infection. So preventing infection is the focus of early treatment. Early antibiotic treatment, surgical debridement, can effectively reduce microorganism presence. Okay, so I will now move to turn of the accident emergency of the Federal Teaching Hospital Gombe. The study design is that of a hospital-based prospective observational analytical study, and the study population will be conducted among patients of all age groups presenting to the surgical section of the accident and emergency section of surgery department, with open long bone fracture who would meet the inclusion criteria. The inclusion criteria will be patients of all ages presenting to the surgical section of the accident and emergency of the hospital, presenting within 24 hours of the time of injury, who have given consent or have got assent in cases of minors. The exclusion criteria will be those with high risk of infection, such as patients with comorbidities, diabetes, HIV, and then patients with known primary immune deficiency states. Patients, as I mentioned earlier, with Gosling-Anderson classification 3C fractures because of the mode of management, which goes out of the methodology I'm going to be using. Then patients on antibiotics prior to presentation will be excluded, and patients with intra-articular fractures due to the methodology I'll be adopting, as we'll see in the subsequent discussion. The sample size determination will be done using the is done using the Taro-Yamane formula as displayed, where small n is the sample size, and the big N will be was gotten from the record of the accident and emergency register, spanning half census here. That's for the last 5 years, which we consider as a half census, with an annual mean of 102 patients. Error limit of 0.05% was used, and imputing the values and adding an attrition of 10%, the sample size 90 consecutive patients to be recruited for the research. Sampling technique will be a non-random sampling technique, and will be employed where consecutive patients presenting with open lung bone fractures will be recruited based on the estimated sample size. The study period will be over 12 months after approval by the National Postgraduate Medical College faculty. Ethical approval will be gotten from the Federal Teaching Hospital Research and Ethics Committee, and written and informed consent will be gotten, as we see in Appendix 1 of the proposal. Materials will be the materials I will need: sterile swab sticks, universal container, syringes, McConkey agar plates, refrigerator, then the performer as prepared by me. So the methods: the first will be the patient resuscitation and recruitment into the research. Following HCA approval, 2 research assistants will be trained by me among the resident doctors in the department. Training will be on the recruitment and the protocol of the study. They will participate in the recruitment of the patient. And here, consecutive patients who have met the inclusion criteria of the study will be recruited, and their biodata will be kept. Resuscitation of the patient will be according to the ATLS protocol for those that will require being co-managed with other surgical specialties who continue pari pursuit as indicated. Blood samples will be taken to rule out other confounding factors and to exclude those group of patients that didn't meet the inclusion criteria, while others would be for evaluation of the patient generally and preparing patients for surgery. Tetanus prophylaxis will be given, and contaminant specimen will be collected and transported to the laboratory. Wound swab will be taken from the wounds of recruited patients, and after taking informed consent, investigator will perform hand hygiene by wearing surgical gloves, washing up of the wound, and using a Z-stroke technique. Swab sample will be collected. While avoiding the edge of the wound, sufficient pressure will be applied to bring out the fluid from within the wound itself. The swab stick will be carefully placed back into its container, appropriately labeled, and then transported to the lab, while the HMIS profile of the patient will contain all the clinical information that will be seen by the microbiology lab for onward processing. So after which gloves will be removed, hands decontaminated, and then that will follow. I will follow up the sample using a Lysone from the lab, and the sample will be properly prepared, and then gypsum staining will be done to gram stain the sample. Then it will be followed by inoculation of the sample into blood and McConkey agar for incubation for 24 to 48 hours. Bacteria isolation will be done and noted and recorded appropriately. So for such patients, they would usually require operative management, and such the need for preoperative evaluation of the patients. So each patient shall be clinically evaluated by the researcher. This will be done carefully following the ATLS protocol, using the parameters of history taking and examination of patient stated. Intraoperatively, patient will be given the appropriate anesthesia And then patients will receive broad spectrum parenteral antibiotic. Zinad brand will be used at 30 milligram per kg per dose using the protocol of antibiotic induction, prophylactic antibiotic administration at induction of anesthesia. So intraoperatively, patient will be positioned, patient skin preparation will be done using fluoxetine solution, 5% povidone iodine and 70% methylated sodium will follow. Wounds will be closed primarily in the case of osteoarthritis 1, type 1, 2, and some 3A. Delayed closure may be used for those that would not fall into the primary closure criteria. Intraoperative findings will be noted. Appropriate implant for the fixation of the fracture will be used. For those that require X-rays will be used and then recorded in the pro forma. For those that would require the use of cast will also be seen. Active drain will be used, the redivac drain, for where necessary dressings will also be applied as indicated. Patients will be moved to recovery after clearance by the anesthesiologist and 3 days. And fractures will be classified as stated earlier using the Biomedicine classification system. Post-operative care, specimen collection from the fractures will require appropriate monitoring either in the intensive care unit as the case may be on the ward. Also, vitals of the patients will be monitored, are recorded appropriately and charted for our active physiotherapy will be encouraged depending on the indication, where also thromboembolic prophylaxis will also be used. Wound dressing will be changed daily using 5% povidone iodine soaked in sterile gauze. Careful clinical observation of signs of infection will be looked out for, bearing in mind the initial culture results from the contaminants gotten at presentation. Forms of wound infection in this case will be centered around wound breakdown, stitch abscess, serosanguinous discharge, or pleural discharge, as the case may be. And if dressing of the wound is soaked in less than 72 hours post-debridement, a second loop debridement would be indicated in such patients. For patients that will develop infection after debridement, the sample of the isolate will be taken as described in the procedure earlier stated. And then for the growth and sensitivity test, the molar Henson disc for 24 hours will be used to determine the sensitivity part. Then specimen analysis will be done by designated microbiologists, microbiology scientists, medical microbiology laboratory scientists, and under the supervision of the hospital consultant microbiologists. The primary endpoint for the purpose of this study will be the presence of post-operative infection within 30 completed days from the time of surgery. The outcome measure, the first outcome measure is the presence of growth of organisms, which will be noted from the initial swab of the isolate to determine the bacterial contaminants of the open lumbar fracture. Then the second is the clinically diagnosed fracture site wound infection, as indicated by microbiology culture results. Being positive culture we define as the presence of organism cultured from the surgical site of the isolate of infected lumbar fracture. Researchers' involvement will be in the recruitment of patients, clinical assessment of patients, resuscitation of patients, as well as performing and getting involved in the operative procedures by the researcher as well. Then specimen collection, following up of the samples, as well as entering of the results of the specimens in the pro forma. The researcher will also be actively involved in the statistician in the analysis of data. Variable, the measurement of variables here, the independent variables will be the bacterial contaminants, talking about the type of bacteria present or absent and the antibiotic stability pattern. then the dependable variable will be the wound infection status, whether it is infected or not infected. Data analysis will be done using the statistical product and service solution version 21.0. And firstly, the univariate analysis of social demographic characteristics of the patient will be carried out, and the basic descriptive statistics will be done. Quantitative variables will be described using mean and standard deviation, median, and interquartile range where appropriate. Qualitative variable will be presented using frequencies, proportions, charts, and tables where appropriate. So the analysis will be based on my specific objectives. So for the first objective, that is to determine the pattern of bacterial contaminants with their antibiotic susceptibility from the wounds of long wound infection in referral teaching hospital Gombe. Univariate descriptive analysis will be done to determine the type, in this case, the various types of bacterial contaminants with the antibiotic susceptibility from the recruited open long wound fractures. For the second objective, which is to determine the rate of wound infection and pattern of bacteria from isolates of infected long bone fractures after debridement with the antibiotic susceptibility pattern in referral teaching hospital. Here, univariate descriptive analysis will be done in order to determine the rate of wound infection among the patients. That is, the proportion of patients who eventually will develop infection within the 30 days of debridement of the open long bone fracture. Again, the univariate descriptive analysis will be done in order to determine the pattern of bacteria from the isolates of infected long bone fracture after debridement and their susceptibility pattern. So in this case, the specific type of bacteria will be cultured from the isolate in each patient and against the antibiotics they are sensitive to. The third objective is to determine the association between bacterial contaminants and wound infection from isolate of those open long bone fractures that were infected after debridement. So here, bivariant analysis chi-square test will be used to determine the relationship between the bacterial contaminants and the wound infection. A p-value of less than 0.05 will be considered statistically significant. Anticipated limitation of the study here is patients that will opt for traditional bone setter after debridement. Also, patients with undiagnosed comorbidities and some other forms of comorbidities that we might not be able to investigate in the course of recruiting the patient. Then subclinical wound infection in open long bone fracture. These are my references. Here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kefas Wida. So I think without wasting time, I think we'll go to our data scientist is here. I think we'll let him say a few things, his observations, and then we'll go to Q&A. So we don't waste time. Thank you very much. I think I've allowed you to mute, to unmute yourself. So. Mr. Felix, are you still there? I saw you earlier. Yes, it's there. Let me ask you to unmute.
Okay, it was not working earlier on.
Sorry about that.
Okay, all right. Thank you for the presentation. Although this is not my strong area, but I would maybe point a few things. If I am not correct, you can point me back to the right direction. Okay. So the first would be the abstracts. For the abstract, the study design, you had mentioned it would be a hospital-based prospective cohort study, that term cohort means something in a study design, but later on, you had mentioned in the work that it will be a hospital-based prospective observational analytical study. So, but before I say anything, I would like to know from you, what do you really mean? Because these are two different study designs so that we can balance this up.
Okay, sorry, initially I was thinking when I wrote, I think there's a change. Initially I was thinking I was going to make it a cohort study, but later on, after discussing with my supervisor, we now made it hospital-based cross-sectional observational analytical study. I think I didn't take time to correct it from the abstract, sorry.
No, okay, it's fine. It's really good you mentioned that, because if this was a cohort study, it means you would have been responsible for exposing them to the risk, and you will now follow them up to see whether they will develop infection later on. And I don't think there's any ethics committee that will want to approve that kind of study.
Yeah.
You know,
Yes.
so yes, it is understandable. It's a hospital-based prospective observation. You know, however, I think it's more of a longitudinal. It has that longitudinal, you know, bit of it. You know, why it is prospective, because you are collecting the data real time. You know, that makes it prospective. You would be observing the patients. It makes it observational. But you see that bit that you would follow them up over time, you know, in terms of observing the time that the infection will happen, or after a while, you know, that follow up, you don't really have it in a prospective observational study, because that one, whatever you are observing is at that particular time and it ends there. But when a follow-up enters the study, because I see that, I hope I'm in the, yeah, because I see one place, you mentioned, you see proportion of patients who develop an infection within 30 days, you see. So I think there's a kind of a follow-up. So I have a feeling it has so it has this longitudinal, because you are following them over time. So, but you would discuss this with your supervisor, but I feel it may be a hospital-based longitudinal study, and maybe not prospective observation, because the prospective observational, most times they are studies you assess at that particular time. You don't follow the patient anymore to see what will happen later on, you know, but it seems it is not like that here, you know. So that is the second, but you can discuss with your supervisor, you know. It's just my opinion. The third one is your study objective, you know, which I think is not smart. You can break it down maybe one more, like the objective one, which is to determine the pattern of bacterial contaminants. That is one thing you are addressing here. Yes, that is specific. But if you check objective 2, you added 2 things in objective 2, and I think you can separate them, because objective 2 is not smart. You have the rate of wound infection. You now have the pattern of bacteria. So that's already 2 in 1. So you can separate it. unless the pattern of bacteria from the isolate and the pattern of bacterial contaminant in objective 1 are the same thing, which is why I'm saying this is not my core area, so I may be wrong. But if the pattern of bacteria from isolate in objective 2 is different from the pattern of bacterial contaminant in objective 1, then objective 2 has to be 2 objectives. But if they are the same thing, then there is no need adding it again in objective 2.
Okay,
So,
no, they're not the same actually.
Okay, so objective 2 will be separated into objective 2 and objective 3. Okay. What I mean is to determine the rate of wound infection, then the other one will now be to determine the pattern of bacteria from isolate. Yeah, because even if you look below, you will see that you actually created 2 notes.
Yes.
to show you that there are actually 2 things you were talking about. Yeah, so it's not specific anymore. Yeah, so the objective 3 will now be the new objective 4. Yes. So which is clear. You said you are looking at the association between the bacteria contaminant and the wound infection. Yeah, which is good. But from my experience, there are other things you may also look at because the way this study is, I am not sure, that well, you have not done the study yet, but I'm just thinking out loud. I feel the bacteria contamination will play a role in the wound infection yet, but I also think there are other things too that may make the bacteria more susceptible, like the type of the injury, you call it the mechanism of the injury, and even the duration of the injury before presentation. These things can actually play key role in influencing the bacterial contamination. So I think, there are aspects you can also add in the association, and maybe other things too, which you would come up with, so which is why I feel objective 3 may not, you may not close it out by saying to determine association between bacterial contamination and wound infection. Maybe you might make it broad to say factors, associated with wound infection. So that way, bacterial contamination comes in, the type of injury comes in, duration comes in, any other thing that you would like to add. So that at the end of the day, if you do your association with the chi-square, those that are statistically significant in the chi-square, we can put them in the bivariant logistic regression. Then later in the multivariant to test for confounders. So with this, we may now know the predictor that is stronger for wound infection, instead of limiting it to just bacterial contamination, which yes, it may be, it may play a role, but we may not know if bacterial contamination is actually the strongest predictor of wound infection in this study. So incorporating that bivariant and multivariant will give us the real predictor, or no, not the real predictor, but the strongest predictor of wound infection, which may not really be bacterial contamination. It may be, it may be, but it's good to look at all sides, so that at the end of the day, So I think that is the things that I noticed. But the aspect in the objective 3 where you say bivariant analysis, chi-square test, they are really not the same thing. Chi-square test is different. That's the one you do first because you're testing differences in proportion. So it's the variables that are statistically significant in the chi-square test that you now bring in the bivariant analysis to check for the odds ratios. Then those that are significant in the bivariants, you now put them in the multivariant. So these are actually different steps. I think I have some write-ups on how to arrange it. So if you chat me up or send me an email, I could share that with you so that you can put it in your statistical aspect, because looking at that aspect of the statistics, where you said, sorry, trying to, okay, you called it the data analysis. So you had said univariate analysis of social demographic will be carried out, okay, descriptive. Then the quantitative variables will be described using mean and standard deviation. However, it is, we call it continuous, really, so it's the continuous variables that we will describe using mean and standard deviation, or median and interquartile range, but whether you're going to be using mean or whether you're going to be using median, because this statement, sorry, Dr. Zainab, I hope I'm not taking so much time. But
I'm loving every minute of it.
Okay, all right, thank you. So this aspect you have said in the data analysis, quantitative variables will be described using, I think it would be continuous variables. Okay, but I'm having a feeling, I'm having a feeling you may not be doing mean and standard deviation. Why I say that? Because your study, you said you're going to be selecting them using convenient sampling. You are not using any sampling method. And it's understandable because the patient with this criteria for recruitment may not be so much. So you may want to pick as they come. Is not a problem. As long as your supervisor agrees with that, fine. So if you're not following a sampling method, it means that there are chances you may have, bias. And when you collect this data, there's need to actually test for normality for the continuous variable. So you would use Shapiro-Wilk to test for the normality of the data, because the fact you're not following a sampling or is already in my head saying this data may not be normally distributed. Okay, so you need to do the normality. If you do the normality and the data is normally distributed, then you will do parametric, which is the mean and the standard deviation. But if that data is not normally distributed, then you're going to be using non-parametric, which is the median and the interquartile range. So the decision whether to use mean or median is based on the normality of the data, all right, or the normality of the continuous, variable. So I thought that's, but what I don't know now is, will your college allow you to do convenience sampling? Because you have a lot of convincing to do. You need to really justify why you are not using any sampling method. I know for hospital-based study, since we don't have them gathered, we pick them as they come. We normally use systematic sampling, where we calculate a sampling interval. You say for every third patient, for every second patient, for every fourth patient, depending on the sampling interval. That's what we normally use for hospital-based study. But now you're not going to be using a sampling method, and I hope your supervisors are okay with that. And I hope you have a good justification why you're not using a sampling method, because we know in research, the moment you use a convenient sampling, that study already has bias inside, because patients were not given an equal chance of being selected. So that's an aspect you need to really clarify with your supervisors. So for the qualitative variables, for the frequency and the proportion, yeah, I think this is the path. You may call it categorical. You may just call the other one continuous and call the other one categorical, because the quantitative and qualitative may be confusing, because what some people understand as qualitative may not be what you're describing now. So the safe ground is continuous and categorical. You know, I think this is just what I would like to add. But you can always reach out to me if you're not clear on any aspect. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
You can be sure we're taking you up on that offer.
Yes.
Thank you. But just before you go, Mr. Felix, are you happy with his choice of tool for calculating his sample size?
Well, I looked at the sample size determination. You know, the one he used is still okay. That's I think it's Yaro, I may not pronounce it well. Yamane, yes. It's a sample size that is usually recommended when you know the population of your study or where you would be recruiting your data from. So if you have an idea of the population, the total population of where you're recruiting your study, then this formula is fine. But a lot of times we don't use it because we don't know the population, you know, of where we'll be recruiting the participants from. So it's not a problem. If this one does not fly, then he would use the regular one that we know. The author Kish also puts it in our book. That's that formula, you know, that is popular, you know, where you have your K2, you have your, you know, you have your PQ, and you have your arrow square. I don't know if you remember that formula.
Yes.
Yeah, you have your K2, you have your PQ, you have your arrow square. So that one is popular for calculating sample size for this sort of study, you know, because a lot of times people are not aware of the population from where they are going to recruit. So they just work with the prevalence of one of the objectives. So in your own case now, it may be prevalence of the wound infection. Then you can use it as your P, right? Then calculate your sample size. But if this is accepted, it's fine. But if they raise an eyebrow, then you should just switch to the one that a lot of people are familiar with.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So can we take a quick Q&A from the floor? So I've allowed everybody to unmute, but please, if you're not speaking, just stay unmuted. Everybody, thank you. So we don't have too much interference from the background. Questions, comments, and if you're camera shy, you can type it in the chat box. Questions? Okay, so maybe whilst we're waiting for questions, I don't see any hands up. Chat box is empty. I'm just wondering, it looks like your literature review only looked at the study from the Uniport State House Hospital Abuja study. It looks like that's the only one you have, except if I missed something somewhere. Then I would have loved for you to project, you should have, if you had used this Microsoft Word, that's like PowerPoint, so that we can see, because you know the West African College of Surgeons has specific guidelines for the font size you should use, the font type and things. So we could critique that. So you don't forget and then you use the wrong font and the wrong font size and things. Then you said something about that your exclusion criteria. One of your exclusion criteria is patients who have been on antibiotics prior to the fracture, in the fracture. You're going to need to be a little more specific about that, because if they took antibiotics 3 weeks before and finished 3 weeks before, then it doesn't count. So you need to be, as Mr. Felix said, let everything in all your goals and statements, let them be SMART, capital SMART.
Okay.
And then you said you're going to wait, and you said something about when there's offensive discharge. By the time you have that, are you sure you're not going to have a lot of morbidity?
Hello, ma.
Sorry, can you hear
Hello,
me?
ma.
Can you hear
I
me?
think I lost you just a while ago.
Okay, but you can hear me now?
Yes, ma. Yes, ma.
Okay. In one of you said that you do, first of all, why daily dressings if you do not think the wound is infected? And then you said if you now find offensive discharge, if you wait for offensive discharge, then you already have a frank infection. There's going to be increased morbidity, and then the patient might already develop osteomyelitis. I thought at the slightest sign, when you see a seropurulent discharge, then there's likely to be something wrong. So I think you need to look into that, and of course discuss with your supervisors. And then there was something else you said I wanted to talk about. Anyway, if I do remember, we'll be discussing that. So those are my observations and questions. So if the chat box is still empty, I don't know if anybody here, I see quite a number of surgeons here. So they should be able to, they're familiar with the criteria of the West African College of Surgeons. And then it'd be nice to hear from them their observations, questions, comments, if there are any. If you have any responses to Mr. Felix and to what I have said, do please go ahead and comment. Let's talk. Do you have any responses? Do you have any questions? Do you have any?
Okay, for me, ma, or the audience generally?
No, you, from Mr. Felix has said a lot. And then,
okay, yes.
Do you have any responses?
I think I've noted his comments. I'll try to harmonize it with my supervisor. Then we look at it. I think I also need to contact him to get some of the points he raised in a more clearer way.
Okay.
Then I think the ones you also raised are very important. I would have to look into it and effect them. Thank you, ma'am.
All right. And then just one last one again.
Okay.
When you looked at your past records, on the average, in 1 year, how many patients did you see with long bone fractures, open long bone fractures that fit your inclusion criteria?
The ones I looked at comprises both the ones that fit in those with my inclusion criteria and those that I would have to exclude. So we have some issues with it with my supervisor because they are not an exact representation of the number, because that also included those that signed LAMA, those that like that. And that was around 100 averagely per annum.
The reason why I'm asking is I'm sure Dr. Khalifa will remember when we first started the post membership thesis support thing that we merged individually with this journal club. There's a senior registrar in urology who had done a very beautiful proposal, had calculated her sample size and things. And then this gentleman, who's also one of the members, somebody from India, but he had worked with United Nations for very long. He asked one very simple question, and that she should look at their records and how many patients they had seen, because she was aiming to finish collecting data, doing analysis and submitting within a year. And it was when he asked that she realized that if she was going to keep her sample collection to her training center alone, based on the figures she has, she's very unlikely to be able to come up with that sample size in the time she had set for herself. That's what I'm asking. Do you understand? So you need to look at that, and then that will mean that you might need to, if you're covered, fine. If you're not, then two things. You might either have to extend the period of your study, or you extend where you're collecting samples from.
Okay.
All right. Thank you. Any more questions, comments? All right. So if there are none, I think it's been a very worthwhile
Sorry,
session.
ma'am.
Thank you. Please go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, sorry, I didn't catch most of the beginning part of your presentation. Mine is just, but it was nice. Mine is just a query on your limitation. When you made a vague statement, like part of your limitation is that patient may have some comorbid conditions that you may not be able to measure, or you may not be able to detect. I don't think you should say something like that, because which comorbid conditions are you expecting that is going to influence the outcome of the likelihood of infection in this patient? And I think something like that should actually reflect in the work. And for saying something like comorbid conditions that you may not be able to measure or maybe to detect, I don't think that would fly. So you should find a way of modifying that statement or removing something like that from it.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Yeah. Any more questions, comments? You see how important this session is for the residents who are running their presentations. I hope you can see how important this is.
Yes.
So any more questions, any more comments? So we don't keep you for too long, so that when we call you back next time, you know that we're not going to waste your time. Okay, so if there are none, I think once again, I will say a really big thank you to the presenter for putting himself out there, to our in-house data scientist. He's ever ready to come join us whenever we call. And then my co-coordinators, Dr. Maina, Dr. Atoibi, and all of you here present. Without you, we wouldn't be here. Thank you so much. So we'll see you again next month. We have one activity every month. So we'll see you again next month, and keep an ear and eye out on the group where we'll be announcing. Thank you. Have a lovely weekend, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.